Thank you for watching our intro to beginner beekeeping here that Big R is putting on for us. We're going to break this into 4 segments, hopefully 15 minutes, so try not to get too bored. The segments are going to be introduction to beekeeping, the equipment that it takes to get started, the installation process of a nucleus colony, and just a general overview of the first year that you're going to need to get back to spring again, with a beekeeping colony. I'll be the first one to say that beekeeping's not for everybody, but if it is for you, you got to be very careful because it's a very addictive hobby. You'll get into the middle of it, and the next thing you know is you'll have chickens and goats and have to move out of your neighborhood. At least that's what happened to our family. So when you're considering buying bees and starting beekeeping, I highly recommend that you put a lot of thought to it, because there's a big commitment there being a beekeeper, because an active bee colony is the same as any other livestock. And so there's a lot of care, there's a lot of maintenance, there's a continued amount of education involved in beekeeping to keep these bees going, because there's a lot of difference between being a beekeeper and a bee haver. A lot of people in the old days, just want to buy some bees and stick them out and back and pull some honey off of them. But since the early 80s, when we've come into a lot of pests and parasites that these bees didn't evolve with, then it's turned into a much different process. So when you're considering it, there are a lot of pros and cons. Okay, so I'm going to try to keep it, because of our time constraints, we're just going to skip right across the top. Okay, so on the cons, the biggest con I can think of to beekeeping is you're going to get stung. You're going to get stung every once in a while. There's no way around it. That's just part of it. But with the proper personal protective equipment, you can really limit that to just a few times a year, or possibly none a year. I know a lot of beekeepers that don't get stung, and then I know a lot of beekeepers that get in a hurry and they get stung a lot more. The next thing, as far as a con, is the labor. Most people will tell you that it takes a couple of hours a month. It's not really a good average, because there are certain months where you're not going to do anything, and then there are certain months like September where you're going to harvest honey potentially that that you're going to step it up. But say in a year's time, you're probably going to average between 20 and 25 hours to maintain a colony, and you can maintain 2 or 3 colonies about as fast as you can maintain one. Now the pros, the biggest pro in beekeeping that is around is the honey. Okay, everybody knows about the health benefits of raw local honey. I can go on and on about the health benefits of honey. But the products that come out of the hive, like the wax and the propolis, are also big draws as far as starting your own bees. So when you're dealing with bee products like honey and wax and propolis, you really don't know what is in the bottle if you buy it from the store, because a lot of honey has been adulterated with corn syrup or even rice syrup coming from other countries. Now, it's not that those things are bad for you, they're just not honey. And so you don't want to pay that much. You don't want to pay $10 a pound for raw local honey and it's 25 cents a pound corn syrup. You don't get the health benefits out of it. At that point, it's just a sweetener. So on top of the products that come out of it is the pollination. Whether you're a gardener or a rancher, the pollination that the bees help with is incredible. If you have honeybees close to your garden, the bump in pollination is 15 to 30% in yield. And if you're a rancher, a lot of cattlemen believe that having honeybees close by, that same 15 to 30% is enjoyed by the wildflowers and weeds. So overgrazed and compacted pasture land has the natural aeration. I know you've all seen ground that's been scraped that hasn't been scarified. It has a hard time growing grass. So weeds are always the first thing that grow. As far as the native weeds, 90% of those flowers that you see are insect pollinated. And it's not that we don't have the native bees to provide the pollination for the native plants. It's just that bump in pollination by introducing these bees into the area really helps the weeds pollinate and seed. And then, you kind of get the point. It just goes through the roots to the native plants, go down into the dirt, for the natural aeration. So when you're thinking about bees, as I said before, bees are livestock. When you're trying to decide whether you're going to be a beekeeper or not, you need to decide, You know, the care that it's going to take to keep those bees going. You know, you need a good location. You need, you know, a place away from livestock, you know, because they're going to get in your chicken water. They're going to get in your horse water. They're going to get in your chicken feed. They're going to be all over your Russian sage. You know, so those bees are going to fly a couple of miles looking for that Russian sage. So it's hard to keep them out of things, but you're going to have to put those bees somewhere where they're protected, where they're in a mostly sunny area, where they've got access to water. You know, there are a lot of things to consider before you make that move to being a beekeeper. Plus, you know, if you're really into it, you're going to want to continue the education, you know, as far as controlling the mites, the varroa mites, the tracheal mites, the different diseases that they have. You know, it's no different than having cattle or pigs or goats or anything else. So, as we're just skimming across this introduction, I'd like to talk about colony collapse disorder because that's big in the news. You know, everybody sensationalizes everything, but colony collapse disorder is a real phenomenon. And, you know, it came in here 30 or 40 years ago. There are several different things that push colony collapse disorder. In my opinion, these are pesticides, the global warming, a bottleneck in the DNA, and the new parasites that they have. So the pesticides that we're most familiar with are the neonicotinoids. The neonicotinoids are the way they treat a seed, that so when the plant starts to germinate and come up, that it's protected from the insect. Well, it's protected from the insect, it's also protected from the honeybee. They carry these neonicotinoids back to the hive, and it gets in the wax and it gets in the honey. So not only is it detrimental to the bees, but also just in health in general, if I forget the exact numbers, but the increase in autism is up like 1,000% since the advent of neonicotinoids in our food. You know, the global warming aside from, you know, not even talking about what causes it, we obviously have global warming because we're not under an ice cap anymore. It's not under an ice age. So these bees, they're having warmer winters and drier summers. So that keeps them active longer with less honey. And because of that, we have a lot of starvation in November and in December, October. So the bottlenecks in the genetics that I talked about with the DNA, the big push in beekeeping in North America are the almond pollination. The almond pollination, it takes 2 colonies per acre of almond trees for crop insurance to pay off on the almond orchards. So with over 1 million acres of almond trees, that's over 2 million colonies of bees that go to California. So with the temperatures required to mate honeybees, as we usually like to talk about 90 degrees, but it's really, you know, anywhere in the mid-80s, you can pretty much successfully get a mated queen. So these mated queens have to come out in April. Late March and early April to get everybody's packages and nukes. So we're in warmer states. So California is a big driving force in the honeybee genetics because of the almond pollination and the queen rearing. Okay, so everybody likes to push the bees to be more gentle and more honey production. And so because of that, we have a tendency to take these good genetics and just reproduce over and over and over, instead of the diversity. So since the new parasites have come in, now the parasite that I'm going to talk about today is called a varroa destructor. It is it's a parasitic mite that feeds off of fatty tissue off of a honeybee. And these bees that we talk about are Western European honeybees. They're Western bees or European honeybees is what they're called. Apis mellifera is the name. The insects, the parasites that feed on these bees actually evolved with the Apis cerana, which is the Asian honeybee. So 50 years ago, we had no varroa mites on this continent. So these bees didn't evolve with these mites. And so the mites, the bottleneck in the genetic material, the warmer winters with the drier summers, and the pesticides, they form kind of like a deadly storm, which is colony collapse disorder. And so since then, we've had a lot of bees that die off. Now, I don't want to talk all doom and gloom to everyone. The honeybees are not on the verge of extinction. We actually have more honeybees today than we had 50 years ago because the commercial beekeeping industry is really the driving factor with this almond pollination is growing and growing, and believe it or not, it's because of almond milk is a huge push on almonds. So the commercial pollination drives the queen rearing and the production of nukes and packages, which keep the hobbyist beekeepers, kind of moving along. You can expect about a 30% winter die-off, and that was, pre-Varroa. Last year, I think I read that it was nationwide annual, not winter die-off, but the annual mortality rate was 46%. So when you're keeping bees, you have to take care of those bees so that you can split and try to maintain your numbers. A lot of people say that you need 2 or 3 colonies so they can be self-sustaining. I typically think if you've never kept bees before, you should start at 1 because it's, for the expense and the learning. If they make it, that's fantastic. If you decide you don't want to be a beekeeper, then you don't have so much gear, and everything to do with. Okay, we talked a little bit about the bees. They're not native to this continent. They were brought in here in around 1622 by the Spanish. The bees that we domesticated, it's the only domesticated insect that people use is the Apis mellifera, a European bee. The Apis cerana is the Asian bee that we talked about. A lot of these pests and parasites, like we have nosema. Nosema is a malady that gets in bees when they can't get out of the colony in the wintertime to use the bathroom. And so now we have Nosema cerana that came from these Asian honeybees. That's a completely different thing that affects them more in the summertime. So these bees are having to try to keep up with this influx of disease and parasite that came in from Asia, from this Apis cerana. Okay, so the Western honeybee, the reason that we use these and have domesticated this insect is they're the most gentle. They're the most gentle. They're the best honey producers. In the cattle world, they'd be like the Holstein. So they're great at what they do, but they're not the best surviving bees. So we are hybridizing bees back with Russian bees, and there's several different hybrid strains. We personally at Burley Bees do an Italians, and we do an Italian-Russian hybrid cross. The difference between an Italian and a Russian is the Russian honeybee was introduced to the Varroa mite 150 years sooner than the Italian bee, so it's kind of got to jump on the evolution trying to be hygienic. Now, when we say a bee is hygienic, we mean that inside their colony, they clean out the brood that may be sick with some disease like a foul brood or a chalk brood or a pupa that is overly infested with Varroa mites because they live under the caps. With just skimming over the surface, there's a lot of information here that we're just touching on the points, but I'm trying to give you at home the information that you need to make an informed decision on whether you really want to be a beekeeper or not. Because if you do want to be a beekeeper, we want to get you on the right path to being a successful beekeeper. So let's talk a little bit about honey. Okay, people have been eating honey that we know of for just over 8,000 years. People have been actively keeping bees for over 4,500 years. There's a lot of drawings and paintings in Egypt of people keeping bees. They first started keeping bees in pots, in clay pots. But that's a long time for people to be keeping bees. They used the honey medicinally a lot because it was antimicrobial, the antioxidants that are in the honey. It's anti-inflammatory that helps with all kinds of things, as far as blood pressures, and it's even, anti-carcinogen. A lot of people talk about the cancers and things like that. Believe it or not, bee venom, just last year in 2020, they were doing research on bee venom with breast cancer, and there is a pain-causing peptide mixed in the proteins of honeybee venom that actually destroyed 2 different types of breast cancer, and that was just last year. So now they're using this, it's called melatonin. Melatonin is being used now in experiments to try to come up with treatments for all kinds of different cancers and tumors, and that's actually in the honeybee venom. The honeybee venom itself is part neurotoxin, part hemotoxin, and part histamine. So when you get stung by a bee, and I said, that's the largest con, there's 3 types of reactions. You can have a local reaction, which is just a bump and it itches like crazy. Then you have a systematic reaction where you get stung and maybe your whole arm swells up. That's a systematic. Anaphylaxis. You hear a lot of people talking about anaphylactic shock, anaphylaxis response to a honeybee sting. In reality, less than 3% of the population experience an anaphylactic response to a honeybee sting. So the majority of people that say that they're allergic to honeybees are having a local or a systematic response to a bee sting. So the venom, even though that's a con, it could turn out to be one of the greatest discoveries of our time. Yeah, the honey, I want to jump back a second and talk about some of the medicinal qualities of honey. The Romans carried honey into battle to treat wounds in the field. That honey is hygroscopic, and hygroscopic means that the bees have dried it out down to about a 15 or 16% moisture content. At that moisture content, it is not stable to the environment because it will suck moisture right out of the air. So because it's hygroscopic, they can apply it to the wounds. It's very sticky, of course, but it keeps all the moisture away from the wound. And then with the antioxidants that are in the honey combined with the antimicrobial, with the anti-inflammatory, you can see why that was a huge medicinal thing back in the day before antibiotics and things like that. So this has been our intro into it. If you guys are interested, hang around. We're going to do 3 more segments, and these segments will be equipment, installation, and the first year of beekeeping. And thanks a lot. We'll see you next time.